The courtroom was packed, buzzing with whispers of anticipation. Reporters filled the back row, their pens poised and cameras ready. A young woman, Sarah, sat at the witness stand, nervously fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. She glanced toward the defense table, where a man in a sharp suit was preparing his case. A case that could determine the fate of her father. At the prosecution table, the district attorney shuffled a stack of papers, his expression sharp and unforgiving. The tension in the air was thick. This trial wasn't just about theft or fraud. It was about a violent crime, a break-in that had turned deadly. And all fingers pointed at one man, John Miller, Sarah's father. As the bailiff announced, "All rise," the judge entered the room. Dressed in his black robe, his stern face gave no hint of bias. He took his seat, and the courtroom settled into a tense silence. The judge's gavel struck once. This court is now in session. Sarah's heart raced. Her father wasn't here yet. She had pleaded with him to show up, to face the charges instead of running. But now, as the proceedings began, her worst fears seemed to be coming true. The DA stood. "Your Honor, we are ready to proceed. The prosecution intends to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that John Miller committed this heinous crime. His fingerprints were found on the scene, and we have an eyewitness ready to testify." Before the judge could respond, a loud commotion erupted from the back of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a bang, and everyone turned to see a man stumble inside, panting heavily. It was John Miller. His disheveled appearance, a torn jacket, dirt-streaked face, and wide, desperate eyes, made the entire room gasp. "I'm not the bad guy," he shouted, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. The courtroom froze. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" But John wasn't done. He pointed a trembling finger toward the DA. "You're framing me. I didn't do this." The tension hit its peak as two bailiffs approached him, but John held his ground. "Let me speak," he cried. "If you don't hear me out, an innocent man will go to prison." The judge leaned forward, his stern face showing a flicker of interest. "Mr. Miller, if you want to be heard, you must follow the proper procedures. Sit down and let your counsel speak for you." But John shook his head, his voice breaking. "There's no time for that. They're after my family. I'm here to protect them. And the truth," he paused, locking eyes with Sarah, "is something you all need to hear." The courtroom fell silent as John Miller's words echoed through the room. "They're after my family." Everyone's attention was locked on him, from the judge to the jury, to the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. Even Sarah, sitting in the witness stand, couldn't look away. Her father's sudden entrance and the desperation in his voice sent chills down her spine. "Bailiffs, escort Mr. Miller to the defense table," the judge commanded, his voice firm but curious. He had seen outbursts before, but this one carried an unusual weight. It wasn't the ranting of a guilty man trying to escape the inevitable. It sounded like something more, a cry for help. John didn't resist as the bailiffs approached him, but his eyes darted around the room, scanning every face as if searching for an unseen enemy. "You have no idea what's going on," he muttered as they guided him to his seat. His attorney, a young but sharp-looking woman named Rachel Carter, leaned in close the moment he sat down. "John, what are you doing?" she whispered harshly. "You're making this worse for yourself." John turned to her, his eyes wide with urgency. "You don't understand, Rachel. They're setting me up. If we don't act now, it won't just be me. They'll come for Sarah too." Rachel's brow furrowed. She had spent months preparing his defense, digging through evidence, and crafting arguments to prove his innocence. But this was the first time John had mentioned any kind of threat against his daughter. "Who's they?" she asked, her voice low. Before John could answer, the judge cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, control your client. Mr. Miller, any further outbursts, and I will hold you in contempt." Rachel stood, smoothing her blazer. Your Honor, my client was simply expressing his concerns under the immense pressure of this trial. I assure you, he is prepared to cooperate fully. The judge nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. See that he does. Prosecution, you may proceed. The district attorney rose, a confident smirk on his face. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you just witnessed is the behavior of a desperate man. John Miller wants you to believe he's the victim here, but the evidence will show otherwise. We have fingerprints, an eyewitness, and a motive. This is an open and shut case. As the DA continued his opening statement, John leaned closer to Rachel. You have to let me speak, he whispered. Absolutely not, Rachel hissed back. You've already caused enough damage. Let me do my job. But John wasn't listening. His eyes flicked to Sarah, who sat frozen in the witness stand. She hadn't seen her father in months, not since the night of the arrest. That night played over and over in her mind like a broken record. The flashing lights of police cars, the officers dragging her father away in handcuffs, the way he had shouted over his shoulder, "Sarah, stay strong. Don't let them scare you." She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. But now, seeing him here, disheveled and frantic, she felt a gnawing fear that maybe he wasn't just trying to protect himself. Maybe there really was more to this story. The prosecution called its first witness, a middle-aged man named Greg Benson, the owner of the house where the crime had occurred. He took the stand, his expression solemn. Mr. Benson, the DA began, can you describe what you saw on the night in question? Benson nodded. It was around midnight. I heard a noise downstairs, like glass breaking. I went to check it out and saw a man in a hoodie rummaging through my living room. When I shouted, he ran. But as he was leaving, he turned back and... Benson's voice faltered, and he looked down. He shot my dog. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Sarah's stomach churned. Her father loved animals. She couldn't imagine him doing something so cruel. Do you see the man you saw that night in this courtroom? The DA asked. Benson looked up and pointed directly at John. That's him. I'll never forget his face. John shot to his feet. He's lying, he shouted, his voice filled with anguish. I wasn't even there that night. The judge's gavel slammed down. Mr. Miller, sit down. Rachel tugged at his sleeve, pulling him back into his seat. You're not helping yourself, she whispered through gritted teeth. John leaned in, his voice low but fierce. I didn't shoot that dog. I didn't rob that house. But someone wants everyone to think I did. And if we don't figure out who, Sarah will be next. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She had heard plenty of excuses from clients over the years. But there was something in John's voice that struck a chord. He wasn't just trying to save himself. He was genuinely terrified for his daughter. As the trial continued, the prosecution presented more evidence. A partial fingerprint on a broken window, a neighbor who claimed to have seen John's car near the crime scene, and the testimony of a police officer who described John's erratic behavior during the arrest. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her father had his flaws, but he wasn't a killer. And he certainly wasn't the kind of man who would hurt an innocent animal. When the court adjourned for lunch, Sarah approached Rachel. Can I talk to him? She asked, glancing toward her father, who sat slumped in his chair. Rachel hesitated. Just for a minute. And keep it quiet. He's already on thin ice. Sarah walked over, her heart pounding. Dad, she said softly. John looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and desperation. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. Why would someone do this to you? What's really going on? John glanced around, lowering his voice. I can't explain everything right now, but there are people, powerful people, who want me out of the way. I got too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. What does that mean? Sarah asked, her confusion growing. John shook his head. It means you have to be careful. Trust no one. Not even Rachel. Sarah frowned. Rachel's trying to help you. John leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Or she's trying to make sure I take the fall. Before Sarah could respond, the bailiff announced that court was back in session. She returned to the witness stand, her mind racing. As the afternoon unfolded, the defense began its case. Rachel called a series of witnesses to testify to John's character. A former coworker, a neighbor, even the owner of the local diner where John ate breakfast every morning. They all painted a picture of a kind, hard-working man who would never commit such a heinous crime. But the jury's faces remained unreadable. And as the day came to a close, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her father's fate was already sealed. That night, as she lay in bed, she replayed his words in her mind. There are people who want me out of the way. Who were these people? And what could her father possibly have done to make them target him? The next morning, as the trial resumed, Sarah noticed something strange. A man in a dark suit sat in the back of the courtroom, his face expressionless. She hadn't seen him before, but there was something about him that sent a shiver down her spine. When she looked over at her father, she saw that he had noticed the man too. His face went pale, and his hands clenched into fists. "Dad?" she whispered during a brief recess. "Who is that?" John's eyes didn't leave the man. "That," he said, his voice trembling, "is one of them." John's chest heaved as he sat at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden surface so tightly his knuckles turned white. The courtroom had fallen into a rhythm again, with the prosecution questioning witnesses, presenting evidence, and weaving a story that painted him as a cold-hearted criminal. But John wasn't paying attention anymore. His eyes were locked on the man in the dark suit sitting at the back of the room, the man Sarah had noticed too. The man's presence wasn't a coincidence. John was sure of it. He had seen him before weeks ago, lurking near his home just days before his arrest. The man hadn't approached him, hadn't said a word, but his mere presence had been enough to make John uneasy. Now, seeing him here in the courtroom, that unease had transformed into outright terror. Rachel noticed John's distraction and leaned in. "What's going on? You're making the jury nervous with the way you're acting." John didn't answer her. He couldn't. His thoughts were racing, and a single question echoed in his mind. Why is he here? The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "Defense, you may call your next witness." Rachel stood, smoothing the creases in her blazer. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Sarah Miller to the stand." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Sarah rose from her seat. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the witness stand, avoiding her father's eyes. She had never testified in court before, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Rachel approached her with a reassuring smile. "Sarah, can you state your name for the court?" "Sarah Miller," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And your relation to the defendant?" "He's my father." Rachel nodded and took a step closer. "Sarah, can you describe your father's character for the jury? What kind of man is he?" Sarah took a deep breath. "My dad is... He's the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. He works hard, loves animals, and always puts his family first. He's not perfect, but he's not a criminal. He couldn't have done the things they're accusing him of." Rachel smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. Now, I want to ask you about the night of your father's arrest. Can you tell the court what you remember?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at her father. His eyes were fixed on her, silently pleading for her to speak. "It was late," she began. "I was already in bed when I heard voices outside. When I looked out the window, I saw the police in our yard. They had their guns drawn, and they were yelling for my dad to come out." "And did your father come out?" Rachel asked. "Yes, he walked out with his hands up. He didn't resist. But the way they treated him, It was like they had already decided he was guilty. They threw him to the ground and put handcuffs on him before he could even say a word. Rachel nodded, her expression somber. "Thank you, Sarah. No further questions." The DA stood, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. "Ms. Miller, you said your father didn't resist arrest. But isn't it true that he attempted to flee the scene before the police arrived?" Sarah frowned. "No, that's not true. He was home all night." The DA smirked, pulling a piece of paper from his folder. "I have here a statement from a neighbor who claims to have seen your father's car speeding away from the crime scene that evening. Are you saying the neighbor is lying?" "I'm saying they're mistaken," Sarah replied firmly. The DA leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or maybe you're the one who's mistaken, Ms. Miller. After all, it's hard to keep track of the truth when you're trying to protect someone you love, isn't it?" "Objection," Rachel interjected. "The prosecution is badgering the witness." "Sustained," the judge said. "Mr. Thompson, move on." The DA sighed, stepping back. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Sarah returned to her seat, she felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She had told the truth, but she wasn't sure it had made any difference. The DA had planted seeds of doubt, and she could see it in the faces of the jury. When the court adjourned for the day, Sarah lingered in the hallway, waiting for her father to be escorted back to holding. When he passed by, she reached out and grabbed his arm. "Dad, who is that man?" she whispered, glancing toward the stranger in the dark suit who was now standing near the exit, talking on his phone. John's face darkened. "He's the reason we're here." "What do you mean?" Before John could answer, the bailiff pulled him away. "Keep moving." Sarah watched as her father disappeared down the corridor, her mind racing with questions. She turned back toward the man in the suit, but he was gone. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in her mind. Her father's outburst, the strange man in the courtroom, the DA's relentless questioning. None of it made sense. Finally, unable to bear the silence, she got up and grabbed her laptop. If her father couldn't tell her the truth, she would find it herself. She started by searching the man in the suit. She didn't have a name, but she remembered his face and the faint logo on the lapel of his jacket, a symbol she recognized as belonging to a private security firm. After hours of digging, she found a company website and a list of employees. And there he was, Mark Collins, a consultant with ties to several high-profile criminal cases. But the deeper she dug, the more questions she uncovered. Mark Collins wasn't just a consultant. He had a history of working with organizations that operated in legal gray areas, companies accused of planting evidence, intimidating witnesses, and manipulating trials. Sarah's stomach churned. Was this the man her father was afraid of? And if so, what did he want with them? The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse early, determined to confront Mark Collins. But when she entered the building, he was nowhere to be found. Instead, she found Rachel, who was reviewing her notes in the hallway. "Rachel, can I talk to you for a minute?" Rachel looked up, surprised. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Do you know anything about a man named Mark Collins?" "He was in the courtroom yesterday." Rachel's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I've heard the name. Why?" "I think he's involved in my dad's case," Sarah said. "And not in a good way." Rachel frowned. "Sarah, you need to be careful. If Mark Collins is who I think he is, you don't want to draw his attention." "What do you mean?" Rachel leaned in, lowering her voice. "Mark Collins works for people who have a lot to lose. People who will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. If he's involved, it means your father stumbled onto something much bigger than we realized." Sarah's heart pounded. "Then we have to do something. We can't just let them get away with this." Rachel sighed. "It's not that simple, but I'll see what I can find out." In the meantime, keep your head down and stay out of trouble." Sarah nodded, but her resolve had only grown stronger. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for someone else to solve this. If her father's life was on the line, she would do whatever it took to uncover the truth, even if it meant putting herself in danger. Sarah's determination grew sharper as she left Rachel in the hallway. Mark Collins wasn't just a name anymore. He was a threat, a puzzle piece in the mystery surrounding her father's case. Her instincts told her that if she didn't act soon, the forces working against them would tighten their grip. She stepped outside the courthouse into the crisp morning air, clutching her phone. Collins might be a dangerous man, but dangerous people often left trails. She opened her phone's browser and dove deeper into her search, scrolling through forums and articles that mentioned his name. Every piece of information painted the same picture. Mark Collins was a fixer, a man who made problems disappear no matter the cost. But one post caught her eye. It wasn't about Collins himself, but about a case he had allegedly handled a few years prior. The case had eerie similarities to her father's. A man wrongfully accused, the sudden appearance of planted evidence, and witnesses who had mysteriously changed their testimonies. The post's author claimed to have recordings that could expose everything but had gone silent after the post was published. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Was this what Collins did? Manufacture guilt to protect the guilty? She needed to find the author of that post. Back in the courtroom, the trial resumed with a subdued energy. John noticed the absence of Mark Collins and felt a flicker of hope. But that hope quickly vanished when the prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence, a blurry surveillance photo that allegedly placed him near the scene of the crime. The jury murmured as the photo was projected onto the screen. Rachel immediately objected. "Your Honor, this evidence was not disclosed to the defense prior to trial. I request an immediate review of its admissibility." The judge frowned. "Approach the bench." As Rachel argued with the prosecution, John's eyes darted to the photo. Something about it didn't sit right with him. The angle was odd, and the timestamp seemed off. He leaned toward Rachel when she returned. "That photo, it's fake." Rachel nodded. "I know, but proving that in court is another matter." Meanwhile, Sarah had tracked down the author of the forum post, a man named Eric Lawson. He lived 2 towns over, in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of the city. She skipped school and drove there, her heart pounding as she approached his door. She knocked, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. A disheveled man with bloodshot eyes peered out. "Eric Lawson?" she asked. "Who's asking?" "I need your help," Sarah said quickly. "It's about Mark Collins. My dad's on trial, and I think he's been set up." Eric's eyes narrowed, and he started to close the door. "I don't know anything. Leave me alone." Sarah shoved her foot in the door. "Please. I read your post online. You said you had proof recordings. If you don't help me, they're going to ruin my dad's life, just like they did to you." Eric froze, his face twisting with fear and anger. Finally, he opened the door enough to let her in. The apartment was a mess. Papers and empty bottles scattered everywhere. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he said, collapsing onto the couch. "Then tell me," Sarah pleaded. "Help me understand." Eric sighed, rubbing his temples. "Collins doesn't work for himself. He's part of a network, lawyers, cops, even judges. They protect people who can afford their services, and they bury anyone who gets in their way. I tried to expose them, but they made sure no one would believe me." "What about the recordings?" Sarah pressed. Eric hesitated, then reached under the couch and pulled out a small USB drive. "This is all I have left. It's not much, but maybe it'll help you." Sarah took the drive, her hands trembling. "Thank you." Eric grabbed her arm as she turned to leave. "Be careful. Once you start digging, they'll come after you too." That evening, Sarah plugged the USB drive into her laptop. The files were chaotic. Dozens of audio recordings with no labels, as if Eric had been too rushed or too scared to organize them. She clicked on the first one and held her breath. The voice was unmistakable. Mark Collins. "Make sure the evidence is planted before sunrise," he said, "and get rid of the original files. We can't afford loose ends." Sarah's stomach churned. This was it, proof that Collins was orchestrating false accusations. But she needed more. She clicked through file after file, piecing together a timeline of corruption that stretched back years. Finally, she found one that made her blood run cold. It was a recording of Collins speaking to someone about her father's case. "The Miller situation is under control," Collins said. "We've got the neighbor's testimony, the surveillance photo, and the DA in our pocket. He'll go down for this, just like the others." Sarah slammed the laptop shut, her mind racing. This was bigger than her father's trial. This was a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of the justice system. But what could she do? If she presented the recordings in court, Collins would find a way to discredit them, or worse, silence her. She needed a plan. The next morning, Sarah returned to the courthouse, the USB drive tucked safely in her pocket. She found Rachel in a quiet corner of the lobby and told her everything. Rachel's eyes widened as she listened. "If this is true, it could blow the case wide open. But we need to be careful. If Collins catches wind of this, he'll shut us down before we can act." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Rachel thought for a moment, then nodded. "We'll introduce the recordings as evidence, but not until the last possible moment. If we can catch Collins off guard, he won't have time to counteract it." Sarah nodded, her determination renewed. For the first time, she felt like they had a real chance of saving her father. As the trial continued, Rachel skillfully cross-examined the prosecution's witnesses, chipping away at their credibility. The jury's confidence in the DA's case began to waver, but the surveillance photo still loomed over everything. When the defense rested, Rachel stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has one final piece of evidence to present." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Rachel played the first recording. Collins's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. "Make sure the evidence is planted before sunrise." The DA leapt to his feet. "Objection. This evidence is inadmissible." "Overruled," the judge said, his face pale. "Continue, Ms. Harrison." Rachel played the second recording, the one about John's case. The jury's eyes widened, and even the judge looked shaken. When the recording ended, Rachel turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man who orchestrated the case against my client, a man who works in the shadows, manipulating the justice system for his own gain. I ask you, can you truly trust the evidence presented by the prosecution when it comes from someone like him?" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Collins, who had reappeared in the back row, stormed out of the room, his face red with fury. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Not guilty. John collapsed into his chair, tears streaming down his face. Sarah ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "It's over, Dad," she whispered. "We won." But as they left the courthouse, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Collins and his network were still out there, and they wouldn't take this loss lightly. For now, though, she was content to have her father back. The fight wasn't over, but it was a fight she was willing to take on, no matter the cost. The sun was setting as Sarah, her father, and Rachel stepped out of the courthouse. The golden light reflected off the building's windows, giving the moment an almost surreal glow. The weight of the trial's verdict hadn't fully sunk in yet, but the collective sigh of relief between them was palpable. "We did it," John said softly, his voice trembling. "I thought I'd never walk out of there a free man." Sarah squeezed his hand tightly. "You're free because you were always innocent, Dad. We just had to prove it to everyone else." Rachel smiled, but her expression carried a warning. This was a victory, But it's only the beginning. People like Mark Collins don't back down easily. We exposed him in this trial, but he'll regroup, and he won't hesitate to come after you both if he feels threatened. John's smile faded. I just want to put this all behind us. Rachel shook her head. I understand, but the evidence we presented today wasn't just about your case. It exposed a larger network of corruption. If we don't follow through, Collins and his allies will go right back to business as usual. Sarah's resolve hardened. Then we'll follow through. I'm not letting him do this to anyone else. Rachel nodded approvingly. I'll start filing the necessary motions to get this evidence into the hands of federal investigators. But Sarah, John, be careful. Until this is over, you'll both be targets. Later that night, Sarah sat in her room, staring at the USB drive. Felt like both a weapon and a curse. Everything on it was damning, but it also painted a target on her back. She plugged it into her laptop again. Scrolling through the recordings she hadn't had time to review earlier. One in particular caught her attention. It wasn't a conversation but a voicemail. Collins's voice, frantic and angry. Listen to me. I don't care how you do it, but I want Miller's daughter out of the picture. She's been digging where she shouldn't, and if she keeps this up, we'll all go down. Sarah's blood ran cold. He wasn't just threatening her family in court. He was planning to take direct action against her. She immediately called Rachel. I just found another recording. Collins is targeting me now. He left a voicemail telling someone to get me out of the picture. Rachel swore under her breath. Okay, listen to me carefully. You need to stay somewhere safe tonight. Don't go anywhere alone, and don't let anyone you don't trust into your house. I'll inform the authorities. But until then, we have to assume he's already made a move. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office on the outskirts of town, Mark Collins paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. You told me this case was airtight, he snapped. Now I'm the one left cleaning up the mess. The voice on the other end was calm. The girl blindsided us. We didn't anticipate her getting her hands on the recordings. Collins slammed his fist on the desk. I don't want excuses. I want results. If we don't shut her up, everything we've built is going to crumble. Understood. We're handling it. Collins ended the call and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He wasn't used to losing, and he wasn't about to start now. If Sarah Miller thought she could take him down, she was sorely mistaken. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She groggily reached for it, her heart sinking when she saw dozens of missed calls from Rachel. She answered immediately. Rachel? What's wrong? There was an incident last night, Rachel said, her voice tense. One of the witnesses who testified against Collins was found unconscious in his home. It looks like an overdose, but I'm not buying it. This is a message, Sarah. He's tying up loose ends. Sarah sat up straight, her pulse racing. What do we do? You keep your head down, Rachel said firmly. I'm filing an emergency injunction to get federal protection for you and your dad. In the meantime, don't trust anyone. And whatever you do, don't go anywhere without telling me first. But Sarah wasn't one to sit idly by. As soon as the call ended, she grabbed her laptop and began piecing together everything she had on Collins. Names, dates, connections. She needed to find the cracks in his armor. Hours passed, and her room became a maze of sticky notes and printed articles. Every lead seemed to connect back to the same place, a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was listed as a shipping company, but multiple sources suggested it was Collins's base of operations. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. Stay away from this. You don't know what you're dealing with. She stared at the message, her hands trembling. It was a warning, but it only fueled her determination. By the time evening rolled around, Sarah had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for Collins to come after her. She was going to take the fight to him. The moon hung high in the sky as Sarah parked her car a safe distance from the warehouse. The air was cold, and her breath came out in wispy clouds as she stepped out, clutching her phone tightly. She knew she was taking a massive risk, but this was her chance to get undeniable proof to bring Collins down once and for all. She had spent hours preparing. Her phone was set to record, her location shared with Rachel, and she had a small flashlight tucked into her jacket. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn back, but her father's face, full of anguish as he sat in the defendant's chair, kept her moving forward. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusty exterior illuminated by flickering floodlights. She crouched low, making her way toward a side entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. Felt too easy. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself as she pushed the door open. Inside, the warehouse was vast and eerily quiet. Stacks of crates lined the walls, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. She crept through the shadows, her eyes scanning for anything incriminating. In the center of the space, she spotted a desk cluttered with papers and a laptop. It was unguarded, but Sarah knew she had little time to act. She darted toward it, her fingers trembling as she began flipping through the documents. Names, account numbers, and transactions, it was all here. This was the evidence she needed. But before she could take a photo, a voice behind her froze her in place. Well, if it isn't Sarah Miller." She spun around to see Mark Collins emerging from the shadows, flanked by two burly men. His face was a mask of smug satisfaction. "I warned you to stay out of this," he said, his tone dangerously calm. "But you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Sarah's mind raced. She clutched her phone tighter, praying the recording was still running. "You won't get away with this, Collins. Everything you've done, it's all right here. The police will." He laughed, cutting her off. "The police? You really think they'll believe some nosy little girl? You're nothing, Sarah. And after tonight, no one will even remember you." He nodded to his men, who began closing in on her. Desperation took over. Sarah grabbed a nearby crate and hurled it toward them, creating a brief opening. She bolted toward the nearest exit, her heart pounding as footsteps thundered behind her. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she burst outside. She didn't stop, sprinting toward her car, but before she could reach it, one of Collins's men grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "Let me go," she screamed, struggling against his grip. The man smirked, his grip tightening. But before he could drag her back, the sound of tires screeching broke through the chaos. A black SUV came barreling into the lot, its headlights blinding. The vehicle skidded to a halt, and the driver's door flew open. "Get your hands off her," Rachel shouted, stepping out with a determined glare. Behind her, two federal agents emerged, their weapons drawn. "Mark Collins, you're under arrest," one of them barked. The man holding Sarah released her immediately, raising his hands in surrender. Collins, however, made a run for it, darting toward the warehouse. Sarah watched as the agents pursued him, disappearing into the building. Rachel ran to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softening. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I got the evidence, Rachel. It's all in there." Rachel smiled. "You did good, Sarah. Now let's make sure it counts." The next few hours were a blur. Collins was apprehended, and the warehouse was swarmed by federal agents. Sarah sat on the back of an ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she recounted everything to Rachel. "You were reckless," Rachel said, though there was a hint of pride in her tone. "But you might have just saved a lot of lives." John arrived shortly after, his face pale with worry. He pulled Sarah into a tight hug, holding her as though he'd never let go. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You'll never lose me, Dad," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "Not as long as we stick together." In the days that followed, the evidence Sarah had gathered became the cornerstone of a massive investigation. Collins and his network were dismantled, their corruption laid bare for the world to see. Sarah and her father were finally free to rebuild their lives, but they knew the fight for justice was far from over. As Sarah sat in her room, staring at a news report about Collins's arrest, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She had faced her fears, fought for her family, and won. And in the end, she realized something important. She wasn't just a victim in someone else's story. She was the hero of her own.